ECG from body fluids and circulation. So this is one of the important topic for NEET exam. So let us discuss in detail about ECG. So what is the full form of ECG? There are two full forms for ECG. One is electrocardiogram, the other one is electrocardiograph. Electrocardiogram is very commonly used term for ECG. Now electrocardiogram. Electrocardiogram is a report where we can see the graphical representation on a piece of paper. When it's come to the electrocardiograph is a device or instrument. So this difference between a graph and gram is very very important. For example, electrocardiogram is a report. Electrocardiograph is a machine. Now coming to there is a one more term also very commonly used for the ECG, that is all about EKG. So in German language, electrocardiogram, KTRO, electrocardio, KRDIO, electrocardiogram or graph when it's come to the German language. So this is also some very commonly used term for EKG. So when it's come to the India, it is all about ECG, electrocardiogram. So with the help of ECG, so we can understand the electrical activity in the heart during cardiac cycle. So it is all about electrical activity of the heart during cardiac cycle. So what we can understand when we look at the ECG, we know that ECG there is a monitor. There are some electrodes or sensors very commonly called leads. So very commonly seen leads are there in the ECG machine or device. There are two types of ECGs are available throughout the world. One is a standard ECG. The other one is a detailed ECG. So standard ECG, it is all about 3 leads or 3 sensors are there. When it's come to the detailed ECG, there are 12 leads are very commonly used in the detailed ECG. Now we are discussing it is all about a standard ECG where 3 leads are there. So when it's come to the detailed ECG, it is all about 12 leads are there. Out of 3 leads, one on each wrist, one on right wrist, and that is all about one in the right side, and in the left side it is all about left wrist and left ankle. So this point is very important. For example, which side 2 leads are there and which sides 1 lead is there. Right side 1 lead, it is all about the right wrist. Left side it is all about 2 leads are there. So it is all about one on the wrist, other one in the ankle. How to remember where 2, where 1? So left side heart is there. So that is the reason to remember for longer time there is a need of one more lead. So when it's come to the graphical representation of this particular ECG, we can see there are some elevations and there are some depressions in the waves. So these are very 5 waves very commonly seen in the ECG. They are from P, Q, R, S, T. 5 waves are very commonly seen. Out of 5 waves, when it's come to the P, R, S are the positive waves, whereas the P, Q, R, S, T. Whereas the P or T are the positive waves, whereas the Q and S are, it is all about depressions, where it is all about negative waves. So when we look at the ECG report, so for a NEET exam there are 2 things are very very important for exam. So what is each wave represents, and there are sometimes there are intervals also important for exam. So there are 5 waves and it is all about three important waves. QRS complex, it's a combination of three waves. So what is the each wave represents, and that leads to what is the event. These are the two things are very important for exam. So P wave represents atrial repolarization. So QRS complex, P wave represents. So P wave, it is all about atrial depolarization, that leads to atrial systole or atrial contraction. So QRS complex. So QRS complex, it is all about ventricular depolarization, or it is all about that leads to ventricular systole or ventricular contraction. Whereas the T wave, so T wave represents a ventricular repolarization, that leads to ventricular diastole. Here we can see here there are two events are there. There is something called depolarization or repolarization, the systole or diastole. So here depolarization leads to systole, repolarization leads to diastole. So these two are two different events. The P wave represents atrial depolarization or excitation, whereas that leads to atrial contraction. That event is a mechanical event, it requires some duration of time. So now when you look at the board here, there is something called a PR interval. This is what is called PR interval, and from here the ventricular contraction starts shortly after Q wave. Here shortly after Q wave, and the end of the T wave. The end of the T wave, that marks the end of the ventricular contraction. These two lines are very important for exam. So the ventricular contraction, QRX complex, that represents ventricular depolarization. So that depolarization, that leads to ventricular contraction. So this ventricular contraction starts shortly after Q wave, and the end of the T wave, that marks the end of the ventricular systole. These two lines are very important for exam. So this intervals represents a systole or contraction. A PR interval represents that's all about atrial systole, and this particular QT interval. This QT interval, that represents ventricular systole or contraction. So there is a one confusion very commonly seen in the students. A T wave represents ventricular repolarization, but end of the T wave, that represents end of the ventricular systole. Why? Because it is all about the ventricular contraction starts shortly after Q wave, and that is the reason it takes, that is what, when you look at the entire cardiac cycle, it is all about 0.8 seconds, 0.4 seconds it is all about joint diastole, whereas the ventricular systole it takes 0.3 seconds, whereas the atrial systole it is all about 0.1 second. For excitation or depolarization it takes microseconds of time, but contraction, which is a mechanical event, it requires some duration of time. So this QT interval, that indicates it is all about ventricular systole or ventricular contraction.